Bonsoir, bonsoir à tous et merci.
Hello everyone, and thank you for being here today for this late night session, which is happening late but will be very interesting, and it will be on Europe's ability to be sovereign. Let's start with a diagnosis exercise on what happened these last few months. As you've seen it, the Strait of Hormuz, which is a point of passage for 20% of the global petroleum, is under tension. Every single escalation between Washington and Tehran has led to an increase in our energy bills. We are not deciding, we are suffering here. Beijing controls 70% of critical mineral refinery when it comes to rare earth, graphite, everything that can be entered into a radar, a wind turbine. It's up to 99% of rare earths coming from China. And when commercial tensions increase, Beijing shuts off the lever. So it is a lever that is under their control and not ours. And a few more figures: 80% of our digital technology is imported. 80% of our military equipment has been bought outside of Europe. 60% of payments by cards are controlled by Visa and MasterCard, and every year American companies are investing 700 billion euros more than our European companies. So maybe you are wondering what the end of the story will be when you do not invest. Well, let's just look at what's happening in the automobile sector. Chinese cars were almost non-existent in Europe in 2020. I'm not saying in 2005, in 2020, and now they represent 6% of the market, and we estimate they will represent 15% in 2035, in spite of tariffs up to 40%. So that's an issue of anticipation, and at every single shock we hear the exact same sentence: Europe must wake up, Europe must become sovereign. Very well, but if we haven't done it yet, it's because there's a massive obstacle, which is knowing who should pay for it. And are we willing to pay the price for it? Before we answer that question, I want to mention the necessary trade-offs.
Il y a beaucoup d'épargne européenne, mais elle.
Let's look at savings in Europe. It's quite sleepy when North American funds, in the meantime, are buying up our own infrastructure. Not everything, because Matthias is doing a lot to avoid that. So the trade-off is triple. Are we willing to have Europeans investing in all of Europe, not just in their own country? Are they willing to buy shares and not just state debt? And how to make investments as profitable as in the US? Because without yield, without profit, we can talk, but no narrative will attract capitals. Airbus has proved that we become big only by renouncing being alone, but that renouncement has a price. It might be shutting down plants, it might be national players merging, it might be dependencies that have to be created. So the second trade-off to accept is, do we prefer having 27 theoretical sovereignties or having a few champions in some strategic domains? The energy sector, that's the third trade-off. Without safe, secure, and accessible energy, we have no sovereignty, because it's the physical foundation behind everything. But it necessitates massive investments for benefits that will come in 20, 30 years. So who should be paying for it? The taxpayer, the consumer, the industrial player, and who agrees on waiting for profit? And another point which is very interesting, and Nicolas will tell us about it, payments. The president of the Economic Commission of the European Parliament has said it brutally. She said Trump could cut everything off. Everything else is poetry. So we have Wiro, Bizum, and other systems in Europe, but the trade-off is real. The North American systems are very practical. They're very much installed. They're global. Are we really willing to favor a European bank or platform when the North American option is the simplest one in the short term? So you've understood what I've been saying. Sovereignty is built by choices and investments. And that's what we will talk about today. And I will now give the floor to Catherine so she can introduce our panel. Good evening to everyone. My name is Catherine Porter. I am a correspondent of the New York Times and I'm based in Paris. And I have the privilege to moderate this panel. I will do it in French, not in English. But please be indulgent. Please do not mind my accent and my small grammatical mistakes. Before we get started, here are our guests for tonight. Jean-Pierre Clamadieu, President of ENGIE and Energy Global Leader. Next to him we have Guillaume Faury, who is the CEO of Airbus, a major player in the aerospace industry. Next to him we have Nicolas Namias, who is the chairman of BPCE, the second bank in France. And finally, Matthias Burkhardt, CEO of RDN, a major global player in finance and infrastructure. So the topic of today's session is vast and complex. As Laurent said it, the world changes fast and the challenges are immense. So let's start with you, Jean-Pierre. As a president of a large energy group, what does it mean concretely for you when we talk of European sovereignty? And how can we make it progress? Good evening, everyone. Thank you for this question. I'll have a bit of an optimistic approach, maybe because we are in Aix and the weather is nice and it's the end of the day. But I personally think that European sovereignty in terms of energy, we're building it at the moment. Maybe not fast enough, and there are a few gray zones on which we need to work, but we're making progress. So we start with a basic diagnosis. Europe has, at the moment, almost no fossil fuel resources. So all the needs that we have in terms of petroleum or gas are imported, and that's a bill that can come up, depending on the years, between 400 and 600 billion euros a year. So indeed, for Europe, sovereignty means being able to greatly reduce this dependency on fossil fuel energy, and that's something we've started working on with a lot of enthusiasm a few years ago when we worked on the energy transition. The goal was a climate goal. It's a great starting point to keep going along the same path, but realizing that the climate goal and the sovereignty goal, the independence goal, all these three goals are very much aligned. What are we doing concretely? Well, the EU has started working on a two-pronged approach, electrifying energy consumption, firstly, so replacing using a thermal engine by electrical vehicles, convincing industrial players to electrify their processes, and then we are also transforming our electricity production system by producing green electricity coming from renewable sources or by coming from the nuclear sector for countries that have decided to do so. And we're making progress. Last year in Europe, about half of the electricity produced, I'm not talking about production capacity, I'm not talking about wind turbines that do not work because there's no wind, but half of the energy produced was produced from renewable sources, from the sun, from the wind, from hydraulics, and that's a reality and that's a transformation that's at play. And we have to keep implementing that transformation, and that's how gradually we become independent. I'll take a simple example. Earlier you mentioned the Strait of Hormuz. Indeed, the blockage of that strait led to an increase by 50% of gas prices. Europe is a great importer of gas. It has a few gas fields here and there, but it's importing a lot of gas, so our bill has increased. However, in a few countries, France and Spain, there has been no impact on the price of electricity, because in these countries we have a capacity to produce decarbonized energy, nuclear and renewable sources, and we've heard it a lot in French media. They've tried opposing nuclear and renewable energy sources. They are not opposites. The reality is that these two sources of energy actually combine very efficiently. So in France, electricity prices have not changed in the last few months. Of course, I'm talking about retail price. Between the retail price and the price you pay on your own bill, there's a lot lot of different elements that get added to that. So in a few European countries, thanks to investing in low carbon technology, we are able to have some sort of immunity to the evolution of fossil fuel prices. So those are quite positive things. Now, what do we need to make progress on? Well, first of all, 50% is great, but it's not 100%. And obviously, as we are getting closer to the full transformation of the system, the more we're going to go into difficulties, the more difficult it's going to be to completely transform, to green our system. And secondly, electrification does not work for all usages. For some usages, we need molecules, mostly gas molecules. Which usages am I talking about? Well, heavy transportation, industrial processes that don't lend themselves to electrification. And for those specific processes, we have to be able to transform our system of gas molecule access to have access to green gas molecules. It's complicated. In France, in Germany, they've produced biogas, for example, from waste. They're producing CH4, which is the same as methane, and it's put into pipes, and we're substituting gradually fossil fuel gas with renewable gas. About 4% of gas being distributed in France at the moment is biogas. At ENGIE, we're convinced we could reach 20% by 2030. Another element, hydrogen. And now, for the moment in Europe, we are pretty much nowhere in terms of hydrogen, even though we have a lot of the technology and of the value chain elements that would allow us to build an entire hydrogen economy in Europe. For so many reasons that are quite complex, it's due to public and private sectors, we're not making progress on that. We need to really insist on producing these green molecules, because it's the absence of these green molecules that make it difficult for us to reach our goals by 2030 in terms of carbon neutrality. Also, we need to heavily invest in infrastructure. We need transport and electricity distribution infrastructure in Europe that's adapted to our new system, both to be able to benefit from advantages, the fact that we have a lot of wind in the north of Europe, a lot of sun in the south of Europe. That energy needs to be shared in that infrastructure. We also need storing systems, batteries, for example, and that's something that ENGIE is investing greatly. And funding can be private funding, as long as we have regulation systems that are well conceived and which in the end mean that there's a slight increase only in the consumer's bill to pay for this infrastructure. Third topic on which we need to work, and I am about to conclude this first introduction, we need to be able to adapt our electricity consumption to the electricity availability. We need to be able to make the demand vary, and we don't do it enough. Right now, between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. in Europe, there's a lot of electricity that's available. We need to be able to concentrate electricity use over that period. Historically, we're not used to that. We don't always have the tools at our disposal. AI will help us with that. Those are the three main topics on which we need to make progress. The struggle of competitiveness isn't lost. Our experts think that the cost of electricity in France by 2030 will be about the same cost of electricity as in Texas. Why? Well, because the US are seeing their electricity needs evolve very fast, and we've made political decisions, meaning we are struggling to put into place assets to allow for this electricity. And on our territories, we have nuclear power, we have renewable energy, so this means we're almost reaching equality. Not so much for gas, but in terms of electricity, I think in France in particular, we will become competitive again. It's really interesting. Thank you very much. Let's now turn to Airbus. Guillaume, as Laurence reminded us in her introduction, Airbus seems to be the absolute model of what European sovereignty can achieve. And yet, we've just witnessed a sudden stop, the official abandonment last month of the new generation combat airplane between Airbus and Dassault. So faced with this negative turn of events, what's your definition of European sovereignty? currently? And according to you, what are the main obstacles? Thank you very much for this question. Good evening to everyone. So the theme is, can Europe be sovereign? And I think words seem obvious, but it's not that easy. When we talk of sovereignty, the different European players bring very different answers, and the word sovereignty created a lot of misunderstandings amongst Europeans. When we talk of sovereignty, I think the notion of Europe isn't even well defined. Borders are interesting. Well, let's talk of the European Union. And I think it's important to try and understand what we understand by sovereignty as well. We need to ask that question because we weren't asked if European countries were sovereign. We were asked if the EU was sovereign. And the EU is constituted by transfers of powers, transfers of sovereignty between the countries and the EU in terms of currency, in terms of the single market, in the field of trade policies as well. We've seen how important it was in that field recently. And if they've transferred that power, it's because they felt they were stronger, they were more sovereign. But there are some elements of national sovereignty that were not transferred to the EU. I'm thinking mostly of defense, of course, but there's also foreign policy and other fields of that type. So we're in an in-between. What does it mean for Europe? What could it mean for Europe if it were to become sovereign? So I asked that question for fun to many people. I asked them how they would define sovereignty for their own country, and their answers were interesting. Someone told me, and someone from a Latin American country told me, sovereignty means not having your president being abducted. So here we talk of economic sovereignty, but there are also some basic elements. For example, not having your ships being prevented from navigating. So there are some foundational notions related to citizen protection or just being a master in your own territory. So maybe a way of defining sovereignty is to say you don't give anyone else the possibility to influence essential or existential fields. So you want to be a master of your own destiny. That's what sovereignty means. You can be a master of your destiny by being the master at home of one single topic, for example. And I thought it was quite interesting to talk of nuclear deterrence in the framework of this conversation. Nuclear deterrence in France is completely French, entirely sovereign. We do not need anyone else to implement it. But the fact that deterrence is sovereign is not, it's not sovereign because we're doing it by ourselves, and that brings about another element that's quite interesting, sovereignty. So sovereignty means not letting anyone else have power over ourselves, having the ability to decide over existential elements. But deterrence is there to prevent that in the military field. And it's quite interesting because in these conflicts, basically this is a struggle of power, the will of someone else to act upon our own destiny. So deterrence is there to remind us that the weak in that struggle of power doesn't need to be stronger than the strong player. It just, he or she needs to be able to inflict unacceptable damage to the strong player, and that's it. And that's what we witnessed last year in the power struggle, the trade, commercial power struggle between the US and China. There was an escalation. We saw each one of these players resorting to levers and adding constraints over the other that became unacceptable. And they ended up signing a ceasefire for over a year because they said it's hurting us too much on both sides. So let's work on it and let's reconnect again. So I find it interesting because in that situation of power struggle, of potential conflict, sovereignty doesn't always mean being alone, being by yourself, because we always have interdependencies. But it means having sufficient interdependencies so that we don't feel vulnerable towards the other when the other doesn't have vulnerabilities towards us. Now, what does it mean for Europe? The EU faced with great powers like the US, Russia, China, and other major players, ends up in a situation of conflict, of power struggle. Sovereignty means being able to decide on existential questions. If we are deprived from resources, or if a decision is made and impacts us in something where we are very dependent, something that is essential, we need to have at our means coercion measures so that we can respond sufficiently to the conflict, and so that we can make sure we're not impacted. And I think this leads to an interesting idea. You said Airbus is an element for sovereignty. I don't think it's that obvious initially. So we actually are an element of sovereignty because other major players have dependencies towards us, towards our very competitive products in a value chain. We have other sovereignty elements in Europe that emerge, like S&M, for example, which is the entire electronics and tech value chain, and has an essential role that other players cannot go without. So that means it's dangerous to attack Europe on this front because Europe has ways to defend itself. So sovereignty means being able to have fields of excellence or resources that others absolutely need, so that if they threaten us, we have means at our disposal to respond that are strong enough, impactful enough, so that it becomes meaningless for the stronger player to implement their threat. Why is that important to take into account? Because for Europe to become sovereign, it needs to want having fields of excellence, strategic know-how, products, resources that others depend on sufficiently so that they become a vulnerability in other players. So Europe needs to want that. Europe needs to want having champions and domains of excellence. Does Europe want to become sovereign? Does Europe really want to have fields of excellence? Europe was built on a slightly different model. It was built on the model of an internal market where you have to maximize competition in Europe, not to maximize Europe's competitiveness. So we are currently at a watershed moment. Europe, there are so many more power struggles, and the question of sovereignty is being raised. We have to change the way we see things in Europe. We need to want to create fields in which we are excellent, where others will depend on us. So the question, can Europe be sovereign? I would answer by saying Europe can be sovereign if it decides to be. And that's where the debate lies. And again, that's where we're struggling to agree, because in Europe we need to agree unanimously, and that's a topic for which every single country has a different viewpoint. Thank you very much. Let's now turn to Nicolas. So Guillaume just mentioned the need to fund domains of excellence, great European champions, to remain an independent and sovereign player. Is that the way you would define sovereignty? Thank you, and good evening to everyone. I'll pick up on what was just said by Guillaume. I don't know if I should start defining sovereignty. Everyone can have their own definition. However, I think some kind of mastery of your own destiny is what sovereignty means. So, trying to master your own destiny, what does it mean currently? I think it means that today in our societies, in the economic world, in our economies, several major transitions are at play, and they are redefining our societies and our economies. So, everyone can call them differently. We could talk of the technological transition, we could mention the energy transition, we could mention the geopolitical transition. I like to talk of the demographic transition as well. These transitions are redefining who we are redefining our societies and economies. So now, the question in terms of European sovereignty is to know whether right now Europe is able or not to master these transitions. Mastering these transitions will come from industrial elements, but also from the ability to fund these transitions. And that's where I am landing on the topic that I want to develop, which is the banking and financial sector. I am absolutely convinced that right now Europe's sovereignty relies on its ability to master transitions, and its ability to master transitions relies on its ability to have set in place a system of banks that will fund this transition, a financial sector that will fund it. It's absolutely essential for Europe's sovereignty. Let's give a few figures. There are as many figures as there are reports, of course, but lately the European Commission, it was a few years ago, was saying that we had an incremental need of about 1,000 billion euros per year of funding in the four transitions I mentioned. It was a few years ago, so I can imagine it's increased, particularly in terms of defense, which wasn't included initially in those 1,000 billions per year. So now the question is, how will we fund these 1,000 billions per year? It has to come from the private and the public sector. Well, we do our share, for example, at BPCE. Let's take one of the transitions, the geopolitical transition. Let's take the defense sector. Within a year, we've multiplied by 2 our investments in the defense sector. We went from 250 million to 500 million. For the first time, we went and sought European investors to convince them to invest in the defense sector. In the past, there had never been any kind of European mandatory defense bond. For the first time, we emitted a defense bond, and we said to investors, if you invest in this bond, it's in order to invest in the defense sector. And then we'll help SMEs as well. So if I say that, it's because the very first topic of sovereignty is how can we fund these transitions? First pillar of sovereignty. Now, the question that is raised is, what is the share of the public sector? What is the share of the private sector? And what commitment do they need to make? Let's start with the public sector. What's the public framework in place to fund these transitions? Is it appropriate at the moment? I don't think so. Not yet. I don't think we're there yet. And indeed, I am a great defender of European banks, of French banks, of course, but objectively, we are losing market share. European banks are losing market share in the funding of European economies. We are losing market shares as well in global capitalization. We have European banks that are very solid, but they're very much under pressure when it comes to their market shares. Let's try and find an explanation for this, since I wanted to talk of the regulatory framework that needs to assist banks in helping banks in funding the transitions. Well, I think basically everything's quite simple, and I say it very strongly and very simply, but I'm absolutely convinced of it. When you think about it, our entire regulatory framework is a framework that dates back to the big financial crisis of 2007-2009. It took us a few years, but basically in 2014 we set up a new regulatory and monitoring framework for the banking and financial sector in Europe. It has only one goal, that framework, just one goal, ensuring financial stability. Everything we've done aims at ensuring Europe's financial stability, and that's an essential good. Yes, financial stability, we absolutely need it. That framework contributed to it, the private sector contributed to it, as well as banks. It's never guaranteed forever, but it is a great strength indeed in Europe. But there's a downside to it. We only have one goal. All the other economic regions in the world have two goals when they come up with a framework like that one. Two goals. Firstly, stability, like us, but secondly, funding growth. In Europe, we've become the only region in the world where we do not have, where we haven't set growth as a goal for financial and banking regulation. Why? Well, because since we pull everything together based on the lowest common denominator, and basically it becomes stability. And by doing that, we shoot ourselves in the foot in terms of sovereignty. And I'm about to conclude, that means we need the private private sector to really work on that sovereignty, either by coming up with initiatives or developing assets that will contribute to that sovereignty. Earlier you mentioned bank payments. It's the private sector that have come up with interoperable payment systems. Wero in France, Bizu in Spain. Almost the entirety of the European space is covered with payment systems that have been developed by European banks. And on the side, it's quite interesting because the central bank has developed the euro digital, but considered it wasn't up for the private sector. I actually think the private sector has to work on sovereignty. So we need to create change on the European level. That's what we contribute to, which is why at BPCE we fund over 20% of the French economy. We've decided to become a European champion because I think we need to have those players. We've just bought a massive bank in Portugal. We need those European players. So Europe's sovereignty means ensuring funding of transitions in Europe. It means setting up a public framework to accompany that funding. We're not there yet completely. And it's also about mobilizing private players that need to become European champions.
We'll get back to that. We'll come back to the Portugal question later on. So now, Matthias, last but not least, you initiated a plan, several trillions of billions of dollars to support Europe in energy transport and digital energy transport, and digital. So, can you give us your definition and that of your company for European sovereignty, and how do you build it? Thank you. So, I agree with Guillaume and Nicolas. For me, sovereignty is basically you're not yielding to any foreign power. You don't want to control and master everything. It's to have enough leveraging tools to negotiate on about the acquisition of resources, because we all those things are important for others. When in the European Union, in the EU, we abandoned that for years. The idea was to have just a consumers market. I don't agree with Guillaume, which is the founding principle of Europe. The SECA, the steel and coal cooperation. We wanted to, preserve ourselves from war and create European champions. So Europe was perceived as single consumers market, and only that, and it's not right now. Can you consume if you don't control or master your production? Well, we all agreed with. I think it's moving, but Europe first has to build its own power and jobs and digital production. We can't produce everything, but what's key are enough to play a role in the key sectors. Now, in my industry, what we see beforehand in sovereignty, there were two elements. Who operates? Is it someone from the country or from the region? And who owns? And property was not considered as essential. Who owns businesses, infrastructures? Today, the change is radical. We raised 20 billion purely on a European thematic, and the first community of investors are U.S. investors, who at one stage, when the new declaration of the U.S. administration, we said maybe we're too exposed to on one single country. So in Europe, Europe is a region with the rule of law, stable, good proxy for the U.S., and we had a movement of all international investors who actually responded to 60% of this project, and they invest in Europe, that is energy transition, digital, and generally speaking, community or collectivity. So we could feel clearly a dynamics, because foreign investors wanted to be in Europe, where the IRA with the diverted funds. So it's not just a policy it's a long-term policy, but I agree with you, Nicolas. the U.S. want to privilege their industry. That's been, and the Chinese as well. And we want to offer the lowest price to consumers, which is a completely different logic. So we could feel indeed this appetite for Europe, or return of love for Europe, and or U.S. operators within the framework of the private equity. The nationality was important for Asian investors, 30% of this fundraising. They wanted to invest in Europe, whereas 5 years ago they were just happy they saw no difference. Today they see the difference. Nationality does count, and nationality is a key factor for us. So we can differentiate ourselves. We invest in Latin America, in the US, but when it comes to critical domains, I'm talking about semiconductors or infrastructures, of course, nationality counts, and even the vision of the European countries change. I don't know if you felt that before we were seen as French, but we're French, but Europeans as well, and that counts. Even vis-à-vis the British. With the first shareholders of the Heathrow Airport, and I think it does play a role. The fact that we Europeans, is perceived as positive, even if we're French. Okay. So one thing we didn't talk about is the arbitration between European countries to keep European champions. We talked about energy interconnection between Spain and France. They do not exist, and de facto stop having a European energy grid. We can talk about the concentration of financials in France. We're happy with European sovereignty, but maybe our neighbors don't like it. When Italian banks try to buy or take over a German bank, I don't want to be. We've seen with Airbus, we've seen in defense national rivalries. So, can you tell us how we can overcome that? Because we all agree about the objective, but when it has to come to arbitration, clearly it's more difficult. Of course, there are nationalistic views or approaches. You talked about electrical connection between France and Spain, when for some reasons one country says no, France doesn't want a power line that would cross the Pyrenees, whereas it would help our friends in Spain. So how do we do arbitration? Well, for me, clearly, European governance stronger than what it is today, capable of going over a certain number of obstacles that we face, and therefore, it may seem a dream, but we have to simplify our processes, decision-making process, to be able to act faster and to serve the European interest. When you're a company, it's easier. You give yourselves a territory or zone. ENGIE doesn't have an ambition over all European countries, but we have an ambition in 6 or 7 countries in Europe, and we look at the locations where there are opportunities for investment. That could be interesting. We've done a huge investment, 19 billion euros in electrical power distribution in the UK, because we considered there was an opportunity for us to come and support a country which is no longer European, but it is very close to us, especially in the energy. Well, we can help the transition of a country which has electrical supply infrastructure ambitions which are very high, and we want to play the role. Situation is different depending on we think about political authorities or businesses, and for us it seems simpler. I think European fragmentation today is the major difficulty we face versus this, when it comes to sovereignty, in the logic where I described it early on. In every profession or domains where the scale effect is there, well, when we are together, we are as good as the others, but in general rule, it's difficult to get together. So At Airbus, we do have businesses, which are effect of scales. In the commercial aviation, we are world leader. So and in helicopters, we did it. We used a different power, but we were leader in helicopters. So we created 25 years ago in missiles, when it was clearly declining in Europe in national players. Today we got MBDA, not always well known, which is one of the best in the world, which provides solutions not just to the Europeans, but to all the allies with US platforms, for example. So it is possible. However, what we see today is that in order to create critical size players capable of being a player on at the world stage, you have to be very strong and critical in Europe. And we face a problem today in Europe, which is that what do we want? Are we ready to have very strong players in Europe, and of course stronger than the other European players, to be able to be in competition at the good effect of scale? And this is the main difficulty, especially in defense, because clearly this is the topic of national sovereignty per se, and it is a topic where each country has its own armed forces, which have needs which are not synchronized in terms of a replacement of equipment in time, and they want to be able to rely on national players each time we have to do some industrial sovereignty, and therefore we're highly fragmented and very small. Yet we do have a defense industry in Europe, because we have activated other leverages, what we call duality, that is to have technological products, civil and military, and we use this to have a defense industry which is doing better, more competitive than the size it has today. Bear in mind that before the Ukraine war, the budget defense increase in Europe. Before that, the European industrialists received from Europe roughly 8% in terms of volume of activity, volume of investment, and depends of defense equipment, where expenditures, 8% of what the US defense, receive from the US government. It's not 8% less. It's 12.5 times less. So we are correcting that. We are still very far. And the example you mentioned show that, yes, indeed, to do cooperation in defense, it is difficult. We had a certain number of successes. We had some failures. We'll have to continue. But within these cooperations, there are the major countries of defense in Europe, and there is France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Poland. And traditionally, the UK was there, which is no longer part of the European Union. It's not a domain where I'm very optimistic, because in the short term, of course, there is urgency, and there is money in the country. When you got money and you're in a hurry, cooperation is not the best solution. Cooperation is the best solution when you got not much money and you have to share, and you got more time, because yes, it takes more time to do cooperation. Now, if we miss the meetings of the years of the coming years, we're going to miss this for decades. So we will believe in European cooperation at Airbus, and then fail is not falling at one side, is not standing up. We have to stand up. We have no other ideas, and trust me that in Berlin and in Paris, politicians want to find cooperation solutions, because everybody is aware it's essential. Nicolas, time to talk about what you've done in Portugal. The project, the banking project for 10 years, right? So how did you do that, and why? Is it so difficult and so rare? Let me give you a figure which is surprising, is that the acquisition of the bank in Portugal is 6.7 billion valorization, 6.5 billion. There are some major industrialists who sometimes do larger operations. It is the largest operation in Europe for banking consolidation in the last 10 years. The largest in Europe in 10 years. So, honestly, I'm very happy, because nobody would have thought that the BPCA would have do this operation. But it means something. It means that it refers us more to a difficulty. If a 6.7 billion operation in my domain is the biggest one in 10 years. So the question you raised about the condition, I think it's always you need forms of balance, equilibrium, and there is an equilibrium between a very micro and a macro. In banking, and especially in retail banks, we cannot do movements if we don't show the interest for the clients, for the retail customers, for the SMEs. I'm the first banks for SMEs in France. You know, Primo Banco is the first in Portugal. So we have think about the interest of customers. If you want to enter in a country as a confrontation, we won't do it. So we have to come through the interest of the clients, and then the macro approach is that the interest of the client in Portugal is that we'll propose services that he will benefit from the economies of scale, you know, because I've done it in in different countries. So we need to have a micro approach and to have more macro elements and economies of scales. Now, the second element for me, but I want to be lecturing here, again, it's the meeting between a so-called, an approach as a friendly. I don't want to do movements which are perceived as in the interest of. When I do a movement, I want to be perceived as in the interest of the country where I am. When I do acquisition, it's fundamental. Anyway, this is my way of thinking the sovereignty. We will not impose sovereignty to a country. We have to show the interest of the movement. And because we don't have everything in hands, we may also send to the hands of the public authorities and politicians. And it also refers to the opening of politicians or policies and the way a government, or therefore public authority, deals with sovereignty. If a government decides to limit sovereignty to national field, well, you know, I won't be able to do fusions, you know. At one side, it's the encountering on the way I will carry the project in the interest of the country and the way the government will perceive it. In fact, you know, this country, in Portugal, the government is fully aware of the interest for Portugal to have foreign investors who will bring in scale effects in Portugal, you know, and the economies of scale that will be for it's always a balance, you know, for me as a single person, but I don't believe in an equilibrium against, you know, it has to be positive, but public authorities, very much like in supervision, have their part, also share responsibility in the fact that nothing was done not much was done in the last few years, and in my case, in Portugal, public authorities have a responsibility in their success. Matthias, now you can respond to reply to Laurence, but it's interesting to hear your views, your stories on the cloud and AI, because AI is very important, and you do finance or try to finance a major project to create a cloud, European cloud. So Europe already tried that, but the US giants are still leading. So why having this project? Why should you succeed when the others failed? Maybe you could discuss that with... Well, this is a topic that's dear to my heart. I think the first impediment to build Europe is the difficulty in each European country to accept that the local companies should be bought over by other European companies, but non-national. I think we have to respect countries, be loyal where we invest. It seems simple, but we have to succeed and convince people that you are here as well to serve the interest of the country, and you're not going to privilege French interest against Italian or against the British. I think even if the United Kingdom left the European Union, and it was their right because it's a democracy, the United Kingdom is strongly European. Our culture is very close. Our history is close, even closer than other countries who are members of the European Union. So I'm a very much in favor of getting closer to the UK. Maybe it will change tomorrow with the European Union. Anyway, when it comes to the issue of AI, I think we are lagging behind, significantly. It is a key element of our sovereignty, of our competitiveness, and we have to get back to the whole chain. It's not because we'll have 3 data centers that will manage AI. You need the entire chain. Of course, we invest in data center, in energy, in semiconductors. We invest in a small company. It's a small investment, but quite interesting. It's a French company called Zora. It's a company that will do the semiconductor for inference, not to train models. And we'll have difficulties catching up with the media for the semiconductors dedicated for the training of model. Inference tomorrow will be 90% of the market we can invest. So let's not fight the lost struggle. Look at the future and look at the entire chain. Don't say that we'll be competitive on the whole chain, but select the links where we can win, and which will be essential in a struggle competition. So unfortunately we have very little time for questions. So how many minutes? 5 minutes. So do we have questions in the room? Questions, not comments. Do we have a roving microphone, please? Since this morning, I see a lot of French political men and women. It's a shame that they're not here, but it'd be good for them to listen to you as well. So, just one question concerning this. Now, among yourselves in the various industries, because we feel like often they're like swimming corridors, you move on. So you said you have to act in energy and semiconductors. So are there any organizations or people who work to get you together to have common projects? And question is, do we give enough opportunity for contract to SMEs, French and priorities, because it's always a topic, an issue? Well, recent example, because we grouped all the players of domain for the European Gigafactory, and we have a consortium with EDF, Iliad, Orange, Ardian as investors, and I think I forgot a few. So I think there were 10 French companies which are grouped together as the other players did in each country to respond to this common call for tender. It is moving. Otherwise, there is only Mistral today which remains in an alternative. But indeed, I think we have to know how to group ourselves among players who belong to the same domain, even though they are investors in capital, banks, industrialists, because indeed the border is getting blurry, and we have to be to work together and to work within partnerships. And this is why we succeeded to be a reference shareholder and in the other European countries, is that often we are partners of local industrialists. And this is an element to have in mind as well. Yeah, I don't think there are silos, but there are domains. We all talk, among ourselves. But I do believe in the domain, or in the, what we do in the bank level. I want to make sure that, in fact, the entire domain or profession is well supported and financed. Let me look at defense. The BITD, the Defense Industrial and Technology Base, are 10 major clients who are big companies, and they're my clients, So what is essential is that these 10 major companies in defense then we'll work with 4,000 or 5,000 SMEs, and there what we have to make sure is that there is a good business relationship, but the financing has a key role. This is why it echoes my first point, because I want to make sure that the entire industry and all the subcontractors will get the funds, the finance. And to be concrete, and I like to be concrete, today the increase of demands from defense creates, cash flow tensions in SMEs, So, basically need cash flow. So within this framework, I've just deployed specific offerings for the SMEs in defense industry, so that they could have cash flow. So that's a concrete example. I think I do believe in domains, but domains is not a miracle. It comes from the way major companies which are printed here keep them alive, and the way bankers finance them. Jean-Pierre. Simply, indeed, domains is essential, but we need cross-cutting domains. Together with Guillaume, we belong to something called the European Roundtable. It's which groups the 60 largest European industrial companies. We meet twice a year. We talk about the topics, all the transverse themes, and we try to talk to the European politicians to share with them their convictions, our convictions, the problems we face. We don't get a miracle solution, but this is important among ourselves, between domains. And there is a European mechanism called the European Common Interest Investment Project to recreate, not at the same scale as Airbus, but to recreate this spirit of cooperation across borders. There was one on hydrogen, and there are many others. Thank you. I think we are at the end. So, Laurence, do you want to do a wrap-up? Thank you. I thought that, well, for me, the objective is shared by all. The means are the private players who are very active. It is in their interest, and public players have to evolve to help this regulatory framework and help the private companies. Lancing is like anywhere else. We have to get together and to get European countries to work together, and not easy. And you talked about the politicians, well, the objective is to be elected by the inhabitants of the country. So European sovereignty might be a bit remote, but anyway, thank you all. Good evening.
Intéressant de vous écouter et merci des questions.